Hi folks, thank you for stopping by. If you found this video useful, please drop a like and consider subscribing. Also, I would love to know where you all are watching from. Now, let's jump into today's stories. Our story takes place in the quiet suburbs of Greater Manchester, England, in the summer of 1998. It begins with a single, seemingly ordinary death that would slowly unravel into one of the most chilling cases in British medical history. In the quiet suburbs of Greater Manchester, England, an elderly woman named Kathleen Grundy was found dead in her home on June 24, 1998. Her death didn't raise alarms at first. She was 81, lived alone, and had been under regular care from her doctor, Harold Shipman. Everyone in Hyde knew Dr. Shipman. He had a warm, fatherly presence, drove a modest car, made house calls, and treated his mostly elderly patients with gentle familiarity. He delivered their grandchildren, prescribed their medicine, and sometimes even attended their funerals. But there was something strange about Mrs. Grundy's death. She was found sitting fully dressed in her chair, as if she had simply nodded off. Shipman was the last to see her alive, and the first to sign her death certificate. The cause, he wrote, was old age. When her daughter, Angela, read her mother's will a few days later, her confusion turned to horror. It left nearly everything. Over £350,000, not to her family, but to Dr. Harold Shipman. The will was typed, the signature looked off, and it included phrases Mrs. Grundy had never used in her life. Angela went to the police, and that's when the quiet walls of Hyde began to crack open. At first, investigators thought they were looking into a single forged will. Shipman, after all, was respected, and his patients trusted him. But as detectives reviewed his patient list, they began to notice an impossible pattern. Too many of his patients had died suddenly, and almost all had been declared dead at home, with no witnesses but the doctor himself. Many of the bodies were already cremated. Shipman's behavior after each death was the same. Calm, routine. He comforted the family, sometimes offering to take care of the paperwork. He was the doctor who was always available when others weren't, always just a phone call away. The police obtained permission to exhume Mrs. Grundy's body. What they found changed the course of British medical history. Toxicology reports showed lethal levels of morphine in her system, enough to kill an elderly woman almost instantly. And that morphine had been administered within hours of her death. Shipman's arrest on September 7th, 1998, shocked Hyde to its core. His neighbors lined the streets as he was taken away in handcuffs, some crying, some refusing to believe it. But the evidence didn't stop with Grundy. Detectives began tracing his patient records, handwritten logs of visits, prescriptions, and deaths. Each name told a story. There was Marie West, found dead shortly after a home visit. Irene Turner, who died unexpectedly after years of stable health. Jean Lilly, dead before her next appointment. The list went on, over 200 names. Shipman's notes were meticulous, but his computer records contained strange edits, deletions, backdated entries, and false appointments. Investigators realized Shipman had developed an almost perfect method for murder. He'd administer a lethal injection of diamorphine, pharmaceutical-grade heroin, to elderly patients, usually under the pretense of easing pain or helping them rest. Then he'd sign the death certificate himself, citing natural causes. There was no oversight, no second opinion. For years, no one questioned him. What makes the Shipman case so disturbing isn't just the scale, it's the trust. His victims weren't nameless strangers. They were people who had shared cups of tea with him, who'd welcomed him into their homes. Some even left him gifts in their wills, believing he had cared for them until their final moments. But behind that quiet smile, Shipman was compiling a private catalog of death. He chose his patients deliberately, older, isolated, often widowed. He was seen by many as compassionate, but the truth was far darker. Each injection wasn't mercy, it was control. Shipman didn't kill out of rage or greed, at least not primarily. It was something colder. He was fascinated by the moment life stopped. During interviews, detectives would later describe him as detached, almost bored, when confronted with evidence. He denied everything, showing no emotion as they read the names of the dead. Even his family appeared stunned. His wife Primrose stood by him, refusing to believe the accusations. The trial began in October 1999. The courtroom was packed, journalists from around the world filling every seat. Prosecutors presented the pattern: a series of patients, all under Shipman's care, all dead within hours of a visit, all with suspicious medical records. They showed that he'd forged the will, deleted appointment logs, and even tampered with records after the victims had died. When confronted about the morphine, Shipman offered no explanation. In January 2000, he was found guilty on 15 counts of murder and 1 count of forgery, though investigators later concluded the true number of victims was likely over 250, possibly more, making him the most prolific serial killer in British history. After the verdict, the British medical system underwent one of the largest reforms in its history. Death certification, controlled substances, and GP oversight were all overhauled. But for the people of Hyde, the damage was beyond repair. In interviews, survivors' families describe how the neighborhood's silence changed. People stopped trusting their doctors. Conversations became guarded. The clinic where Shipman had once worked became a place of dread, a reminder that evil can wear a friendly face and carry a stethoscope. In 2004, Harold Shipman was found dead in his cell at Wakefield Prison, hanged with his bedsheets, the morning before his 58th birthday. He left no confession, no note, no attempt to explain the years of quiet murder. His death gave no closure. It simply ended the silence that had begun long before. Some say Shipman's office still stands, the wallpaper faded, the desk drawers empty. The neighbors say that at certain hours, you can still hear the faint creak of footsteps, the doctor making his rounds one last time, checking in on patients who no longer exist. Our next story takes us to the fluorescent halls of hospitals in New Jersey and Pennsylvania, where a trusted nurse quietly turned care into something deadly over the course of 16 years. Hospitals are meant to be places of recovery. White walls, the rhythmic pulse of machines, the faint antiseptic hum of safety. But for 16 years, Charles Cullen turned that trust into something lethal. He moved silently between shifts and states, a registered nurse who saved lives by day and ended them by night. Cullen began his career in 1987 at St. Barnabas Medical Center in Livingston, New Jersey. Colleagues described him as quiet, awkward, maybe a little withdrawn, but efficient. He knew his way around the medication carts and never complained about overtime. He was the kind of nurse you didn't notice, and that's what made him dangerous. When patient records began showing sudden, unexplained deaths, healthy individuals who had stabilized, only to crash without warning, no one thought to look at Cullen. Hospitals lose patients. People code unexpectedly, but there was a pattern forming, one that would take over a decade to reveal itself. Cullen's first known victim was a judge recovering from an allergic reaction. The man had been doing well. Then, one night, Cullen administered a massive dose of lidocaine, a heart medication that, in excess, stops the heart completely. The patient died within minutes. Cullen didn't panic. He calmly filled out the paperwork, logged his chart, and continued his shift as if nothing had happened. When the hospital began investigating inventory discrepancies in its pharmacy, Cullen quietly resigned. There was no formal report, no police contact, just a note in his file and a handshake goodbye. Within weeks, he was working at another facility, and then another. Over the years, he drifted through at least 9 hospitals across New Jersey and Pennsylvania. Each time, a handful of patients died under mysterious circumstances. Each time, the death stopped as soon as Cullen left. And each time, no one connected the dots. Hospitals rarely shared employee misconduct details. Administrators feared lawsuits, bad publicity, or the appearance of negligence. Instead of reporting suspicion, they often chose the path of silence. And that silence gave Cullen freedom. Cullen's preferred method was subtle. He would access the automated medication dispensers and withdraw drugs that weren't prescribed: insulin, digoxin, epinephrine, morphine. He'd inject a fatal dose into 4 bags or syringes, sometimes targeting patients he disliked, sometimes at random. Then he'd return to his rounds, blending in with the noise of the ward. He didn't need to be there when the patients coded. In many cases, they died hours later, after Cullen had gone home. To his supervisors, it looked like coincidence. To Cullen, it was control. Some patients died peacefully in their sleep. Others seized violently, monitors screaming in the night. Nurses would rush to perform CPR, unaware that the very person standing beside them, calm, helping professional, had caused it. He watched resuscitations with a kind of fascination. Later, when investigators questioned him, Cullen described his actions as putting them out of their misery. But most of his victims weren't terminal. Some were recovering. Some were children. By the late 1990s, whispers about Cullen's behavior had begun to circulate. One hospital noticed the irregular drug withdrawals. Another quietly pushed him out after discovering insulin vials missing from the supply room. Yet no criminal charges were ever filed. Cullen moved on, reinventing himself again and again. In 2001, he began working at Somerset Medical Center in New Jersey, the job that would finally expose him. There, he befriended a fellow nurse named Amy Luffrin, who noticed strange things about his habits. Cullen would often access the Pyxis system late at night, pulling medications for patients not assigned to him. When questioned, he shrugged it off, clerical errors, helping a colleague, just fixing an order. But Luffrin began keeping track. She noticed that his patients, or patients in his vicinity, often coded unexpectedly. She also saw that Cullen was unusually calm after each death. When the hospital's internal software flagged suspicious medication patterns linked to his login, she went to the authorities. With Amy's help, detectives set up surveillance. They compared Cullen's access logs with the timing of deaths, and the data aligned perfectly. Nearly every cardiac arrest corresponded to his entries. On December 12, 2003, police arrested Charles Cullen at a restaurant where he met Luffrin after a shift. He didn't resist. When they told him why he was being arrested, he simply nodded. The interviews that followed were chilling in their calmness. Cullen confessed to killing at least 40 patients, though investigators believe the number was closer to 400, making him the most prolific serial killer in American history. He described his methods clinically as if reciting a routine. He said he'd killed to end suffering, yet many of his victims had been on the mend. He remembered their faces, their reactions, some confused, some pleading. But he claimed he couldn't stop himself. There was a compulsion, he said, a voice that told him to do something. The detectives pressed him for names, hospitals, dates. He gave partial lists, vague memories. Many deaths would never be proven, either because medical records were incomplete or because hospitals had long destroyed evidence. During his sentencing, the families of the victims packed the courtroom. Some shouted at him. Others wept. Cullen sat expressionless. When a father asked why he had killed his daughter, a young woman recovering from surgery, he simply said, "I thought she was suffering." He was given 11 consecutive life sentences with no possibility of parole. In prison, Cullen avoided interviews and refused to elaborate further. He was reportedly polite with staff, quiet, almost unnoticeable, just as he had been in the hospitals. That perhaps was his greatest disguise, ordinariness. His crimes forced sweeping reforms in hospital reporting systems, especially concerning medication tracking and staff movement between facilities. The case also exposed a grim truth about modern medicine, that even within systems built on trust, bureaucracy, and fear can protect those doing harm. Cullen's story might have ended with his arrest, but fragments of his presence linger. Some nurses who worked alongside him still remember the sterile silence after a code, the feeling that something unseen had moved through the room. The ICU lights would flicker, monitors would flatline, and Cullen, steady, calm, efficient, would be there, writing something in a chart. Even now, decades later, his name carries a cold precision. He didn't stalk his victims through alleys or dark woods. He walked brightly lit corridors, his weapon a syringe, his alibi compassion. Our next story takes us to the sun-bleached streets of Oranjestad, Aruba, in May 2005, where a young American woman named Natalie Holloway vanished under circumstances that would grip the world in uncertainty. Natalie was 18, about to graduate from high school in Alabama, full of life and excitement for the coming summer. She had traveled with a group of classmates on a graduation trip to the Caribbean island, a chance to celebrate and explore before the responsibilities of adulthood. Her family knew her as bright, adventurous, and careful, a teenager who rarely took risks without thought. On May 30th, Natalie was last seen leaving a nightclub called Carlos and Charlie's, a popular spot in the island's tourist district. Witnesses recalled her leaving with Joran van der Sloot, a 17-year-old Dutch student, and two Surinamese men. Their presence immediately drew attention, not because they seemed dangerous, but because the circumstances of leaving the club in the early morning hours on a crowded street raised questions once Natalie failed to return to her hotel. The first signs of worry emerged when Natalie didn't appear for the planned morning meeting with her chaperones. Her friends initially assumed she had simply slept in or was delayed, but hours passed. The group contacted hotel security and local authorities. What started as a missing person report soon escalated as details emerged about the people she had been seen with the night before. Aruban police questioned Joran van der Sloot and the two men extensively. Their statements were inconsistent, and over time, suspicions began to coalesce around Joran. Witnesses recalled seeing Natalie in the car with him, and his accounts of what had occurred that night shifted repeatedly. Despite international attention and repeated interrogations, the police were unable to find concrete evidence of Natalie's whereabouts. Search efforts were immediate and widespread. Beaches, caves, and the rugged terrain of the island were combed. Divers examined shallow waters where bodies might be hidden, and canine units were brought in to follow any scent trails. Days turned into weeks, but the trail grew cold. In the absence of physical evidence, the story took on a global dimension. Natalie's disappearance made headlines worldwide, fueled by interviews with family members, news coverage, and the baffling contradictions in witness accounts. Investigators pursued numerous leads. Joran van der Sloot was arrested multiple times in connection with the disappearance, but released due to insufficient evidence. Other suspects were questioned, and theories emerged ranging from an accidental drowning to foul play, but nothing was ever definitively proven. Aruba, a relatively small island, suddenly found itself at the center of an international investigation, with resources stretched and public scrutiny intense. Natalie's family became central to the narrative, traveling repeatedly to Aruba, engaging with authorities, and offering rewards for information. They worked with American investigators, private security, and media outlets to keep the case alive. Each year, anniversaries brought renewed attention, and yet the truth of what happened remained out of reach. Over time, several confessions and allegations surfaced, often from those already under suspicion, but none provided verifiable answers. In 2010, van der Sloot was arrested in Peru for an unrelated murder, bringing the Holloway case back into headlines as prosecutors revisited old evidence, hoping that his incarceration would finally shed light on the events of May 30th, 2005. Despite years of investigation, multiple arrests, and countless theories, Natalie Holloway's disappearance remains unresolved. Her name has become emblematic of the uncertainty and fear that surrounds missing person cases, a reminder of how quickly a normal evening can turn into a lifelong search. The island itself bears a quiet tension in her absence. Locals speak in hushed tones about the case, tourists sometimes unaware of the shadow over the sunlit streets, and authorities continue to monitor any new information. The family's efforts endure, keeping her story alive and maintaining hope that answers might one day emerge. Natalie Holloway's case is not one of closure, but of questions, contradictions, and the fragile certainty of a life interrupted. In the streets she once walked, the echoes of that May evening linger, a silence broken only by the occasional reminder that someone is still searching. Our next story takes place in New South Wales, Australia, in 1988. It began as a clear and windless September afternoon in Sydney's western suburbs. 20-year-old Janine Balding was finishing her shift at the bank where she worked as a teller. She was known by everyone as soft-spoken, careful, and punctual, The kind of person who never lingered after hours and always parked her blue Toyota Corolla in the same spot near the Sutherland train station. That routine was something she'd kept for months. It was what made what happened next so impossible to understand. When the workday ended around 5, Janine said a brief goodbye to her colleagues and walked across the parking lot, holding a small handbag and her keys. The air smelled faintly of rain. She unlocked the driver's door, slid inside, and pulled out onto the road, heading toward her home in Glenfield, a quiet trip of barely 30 minutes. She never made it back. When she didn't arrive home that evening, her fiancé grew worried almost immediately. He called her office, then the local hospitals, and by midnight, police were notified. They found her car early the next morning, abandoned near the Sutherland station, doors locked, her handbag gone. There were no signs of a struggle inside, no broken glass, no witnesses who remembered hearing anything unusual. It looked, at first glance, like she had simply vanished between the station and her car. Detectives began reconstructing her last known movements. Witnesses recalled seeing a group of teenage boys hanging around the station that evening, smoking and wandering near the car park. They were part of what police later called a street kid gang, teenagers living rough, moving between shelters and train yards. No one connected them to Janine at first. They were just part of the background noise of the city. 3 days later, a farmer near Minchinbury, about 30 kilometers west of Sydney, noticed something unusual near a dam on his property. A bundle of fabric partly submerged in the water. He waded in and called police. It was Janine. The investigation that followed revealed the kind of brutality that shocked even seasoned detectives. Forensic work tied her to multiple offenders, all teenagers, some as young as 14. They had reportedly followed her from the station, forced their way into her car, and driven her to the remote paddock where she was found. What began as an abduction had turned into something far worse. For weeks, the story dominated national headlines. Newspapers carried her photograph, a smiling young woman in her work uniform, and the public reacted with disbelief that such an attack could have been carried out by a group of children. The police commissioner called it an act beyond comprehension. Vigils were held in Sutherland and Glenfield, and people began locking their car doors more tightly than before. When arrests were finally made, the suspects appeared before court under strict media restrictions due to their ages. The courtroom was filled every day, reporters, family members, silent onlookers. One of the detectives who had led the case later described the moment the verdicts were read as the loudest silence he'd ever experienced. In the years since, the site near Minchinbury has changed. The paddocks are gone, replaced by housing and streetlights. The dam has been drained and fenced off. Commuters still pass through Sutherland Station every day, most unaware of what once happened there. Yet for those who remember the story, Janine's name remains one of those that never truly faded from local memory, a reminder of how quickly a moment of routine can turn to something else entirely. Our next story takes place in the United Kingdom in the summer of 2003. Charlotte Harris was 17 years old when she vanished from a quiet market town in Buckinghamshire. She was bright, warm, and endlessly curious, the kind of teenager who filled her notebooks with song lyrics and half-finished poems. That July, she'd been spending her school break visiting friends, planning a late summer trip to London, and saving money from her weekend job at a local cafe. On the night she disappeared, Charlotte had been at a small gathering near the River Thames. It was one of those mild summer evenings when the air feels heavy but calm, and the laughter of teenagers carries down the water. Witnesses said she seemed in good spirits, chatting, laughing, and occasionally walking down toward the riverbank to take calls on her phone. Sometime around midnight, she told a friend she was going to head home. She was seen leaving on foot, cutting through a narrow path that led toward the main road, a route she'd taken dozens of times before. But Charlotte never made it home. When her parents woke the next morning to find her room empty and bed unslept in, they began calling everyone she knew. By afternoon, the police were notified and a search began. At first, it seemed like a typical missing person case. Teenagers went missing often, and many returned after a day or two. But hours stretched into days, and the investigation began to darken. Police divers scoured the river, Volunteers combed the fields and hedgerows around the village. Helicopters circled overhead, infrared cameras scanning the dense woods. Nothing. Charlotte's phone was found 2 days later, discovered by a dog walker near the towpath. Screen cracked, battery dead, no fingerprints but her own. For weeks, the media followed the case. Her photograph, a smiling girl with bright eyes and shoulder-length brown hair, appeared on every news channel in Britain. Detectives interviewed friends, schoolmates, even old teachers. Rumors began to swirl. A stranger in a white van seen in the area. A phone call to a boy she'd been dating. Reports of someone matching her description seen at a nearby service station. None of them led anywhere. Then, nearly 3 months later, a man walking his dog through a stretch of woodland near the river came across what he first thought were discarded clothes. It wasn't until police arrived that they confirmed it was Charlotte's body. The autopsy revealed she had drowned, but how or why remained uncertain. There were no clear signs of struggle, no evidence of assault, and no indication she'd fallen accidentally. Her shoes were missing, and so were several of her personal items, including a bracelet her mother said she never took off. Forensic experts examined the area, but heavy rainfall and time had washed away most clues. Toxicology results came back clean. There was no alcohol in her system, no drugs, just water in her lungs. Her parents struggled to accept the official explanation that she may have slipped or lost her balance. They described her as careful, even timid near open water, and the path she would have taken home was well lit, away from the river's edge. One of her friends later told investigators that earlier that night, Charlotte had received a strange text, short, without a name attached, reading only, "Come back down for a minute." No one could trace who sent it. Police re-examined her phone records, but the number was unregistered, possibly from a disposable SIM. CCTV from the nearby petrol station caught glimpses of cars passing around the time she disappeared, but the footage was too grainy to identify license plates. By the end of the year, with no suspects, no leads, and no further evidence, the case went cold. Even now, over 2 decades later, Charlotte Harris's disappearance and death remain one of the region's quietest mysteries. Occasionally, an anniversary article surfaces in the local papers, with her parents' names printed beside a fading photo. They still live in the same house, the one Charlotte was supposed to come home to that night. People in the area say that on still nights near the river, you can sometimes hear a faint echo, what sounds like a girl calling out from the water, or a phone ringing somewhere it shouldn't. Most brush it off as the hum of the current, the tricks of memory and wind. But those who remember Charlotte and that endless summer know there are some silences that don't fade. They just deepen. Our next story takes place in Texas in the early 1980s. By then, Marguerite Oswald was an old woman living in a small house in Fort Worth, tucked away behind a row of elm trees that leaned toward the street as if eavesdropping. She had thinning hair, a tired posture, and the unmistakable edge of someone who had lived her entire life under suspicion. She was not famous, but her name carried a shadow: Oswald. She was the mother of Lee Harvey Oswald, the man accused of assassinating President John F. Kennedy. For nearly 2 decades, Marguerite had lived in that narrow strip between curiosity and isolation. She granted occasional interviews to reporters, sometimes charging small fees, her voice wavering between pride and resentment. She spoke about her son with the conviction of someone who had rewritten the story in her mind many times, that he was innocent, that there were things people didn't understand, that her family had been destroyed by forces far larger than themselves. Neighbors rarely spoke to her. They described her as odd but harmless, a woman who sometimes walked to the corner store in the same worn overcoat, who carried herself like she was always halfway through a conversation with someone no one else could see. Her mailbox often overflowed with letters, some sympathetic, some hateful. She read all of them. And then, one morning in March 1981, she didn't answer her door. It was the mail carrier who noticed first, the envelopes piling up, the newspapers left untouched on her porch. After 3 days, police were called to perform a welfare check. When they entered the house, They found Marguerite Oswald lying on the living room floor, half covered by a faded blanket. The television was still on, volume low, playing a rerun of a 1970s crime show. At first, officers assumed she had died of natural causes. She was 74 years old and had been in declining health. But something about the scene didn't sit right. There were overturned papers near the couch, a phone off the hook, and an open envelope on the coffee table addressed to a Dallas post office box. One investigators later discovered didn't exist. Her body was sent for autopsy. The medical examiner noted bruising on her wrists and a fracture at the base of her skull. The official cause of death, blunt force trauma. Marguerite Oswald had been murdered. Detectives from a Fort Worth police department quickly descended on the small property. The crime scene offered almost nothing. There were no signs of forced entry, no fingerprints that didn't belong to her, and no valuables missing. The wallet on her nightstand still contained $27. Her old black and white photos of her son Lee as a child, of her other sons Robert and John, were untouched. The only item that seemed out of place was a small notebook lying face down near her recliner, pages torn out from the middle. Investigators interviewed her surviving son, Robert Oswald, who lived just outside Dallas. He told them he hadn't spoken to his mother in several months. Their relationship had long been strained. Marguerite had grown increasingly paranoid in her later years, convinced she was being watched, followed, listened to. Neighbors confirmed hearing her talk about strange phone calls at night. One remembered her standing in her front yard a few weeks before her death, arguing with an unseen person, or perhaps to herself, saying, "You can't erase me. I was his mother." Detectives initially suspected a break-in gone wrong, but nothing fit the pattern. There were no prime marks on the doors, no ransacking, no signs of robbery. The medical examiner placed her time of death sometime between 9 p.m. and midnight, a window when the street would have been quiet, porch lights dimmed, and the sound of cars fading toward the highway. The television had been tuned to Channel 4, a local affiliate that aired reruns of Columbo at that hour. It played quietly through the night, flickering across the walls of her small living room, casting faint light over the armchair where she had spent most evenings. Investigators dug into her final weeks. Marguerite had been corresponding with several people across the country, amateur historians, conspiracy theorists, and those still obsessed with the Kennedy assassination. She'd become a minor figure in their circles, sometimes exchanging long letters about her son's real story. One man from Louisiana claimed she had promised to mail him new documents, proving the second gunman theory. Another said she'd recently received threatening calls telling her to stop digging. Police traced the calls, but found nothing. The numbers have been dialed from payphones across multiple states, Louisiana, Arkansas, even California. None led anywhere. Still, they noticed something unusual. In her kitchen, taped to the inside of a cupboard, was a hand-drawn map. It showed several U.S. cities connected by lines and arrows, ending in Dallas. Next to it, in her small, slanted handwriting, were the words, "He didn't do it alone." The media caught the scent almost immediately. Mother of JFK assassin found dead in Fort Worth home. For a few days, the headlines reignited old ghosts. News vans parked on her quiet street, and strangers gathered outside her fence, holding cameras and microphones. Detectives had to push through the noise. They released no details about the manner of her death at first, only that it was being treated as suspicious. Rumors spread quickly, some claiming she had been silenced by government agents, others saying she'd known too much. Inside the department, the lead detective, Harold Hal Peterson, privately admitted to colleagues that the case fell off. There was something too neat about it, a crime scene that said everything and nothing at once. One clue stood out. In Marguerite's bedroom, officers found an unmarked envelope tucked inside a photo album. Inside was a single Polaroid photograph showing a woman, possibly Marguerite, standing in front of a motel somewhere along Route 67. In the background, barely visible, was a blue sedan. The date on the back of the photo, February 14th, 1981, 5 weeks before her death. No one could identify the location. They traced every motel along that stretch of road, but found no matching sign or building. The photo was faded, grainy, and oddly composed, like it had been taken without the subject's awareness. The investigation dragged on through the summer. With no suspects, no witnesses, and no apparent motive, public attention faded. By fall, the case was reassigned twice. Detectives followed minor leads. A drifter reportedly seen near her home, a young man who had done yard work for her months earlier, a neighbor who'd once borrowed tools and never returned them. None panned out, but something about the case continued to trouble them. The open envelope on her coffee table, the one addressed to a non-existent P.O. box, contained a single sheet of paper, blank except for a typewritten line near the top. You were right. No fingerprints. No return address. When Marguerite's remains were released to her family, her funeral was held quietly at Shannon Rose Hill Cemetery, the same grounds where her son Lee was buried under a small gray headstone that read simply, Lee Harvey Oswald. There were only a handful of mourners. No reporters were allowed inside the chapel. Her surviving son stood near the back, speaking little. Afterward, her belongings were boxed and placed in storage. Years later, most of them disappeared, sold, lost, or misplaced. The map, the notebook, and the Polaroid were entered into evidence and remain archived in Fort Worth to this day, labeled only as unsolved. Occasionally, conspiracy circles still reference the case. Some believe she was targeted because she knew something about her son's role in 1963, that she was preparing to release letters or recordings that could have contradicted the official account. Others insist it was random, a simple home intrusion that happened to involve a notorious surname. But among those who remember her, the neighbors who still live on that quiet Fort Worth street, the story lingers in a softer way. They recall the faint glow of her living room light late into the night, the sound of her radio playing low through the thin walls, the steady rhythm of a woman who could not let go of the past. And then one night, all of it stopped. The house has changed owners several times since. But people say that occasionally when the wind moves through the elm trees just right, you can hear the sound of phone ringing, long unanswered from somewhere inside. Our next story takes place in Lima, Peru, in 1992. The city was tense that year. The air felt dry and watchful, full of soldiers, street noise, and rumor. Peru was deep in its war with the Shining Path, a violent Maoist insurgent group that had turned whole regions into zones of silence. Bombings, kidnappings, and executions had become part of daily life. Amid all of this, one woman stood out, Maria Elena Moyano. She was not a politician nor a soldier. She was a community activist, a local leader from Villa El Salvador, one of Lima's poorest districts, a sprawling shantytown built on sand dunes south of the city. People there called her Madre Courage, Mother Courage. She organized soup kitchens, children's programs, and women's associations. While most stayed quiet out of fear, Maria spoke loudly, openly condemning both government neglect and Shining Path terror. By early 1992, her voice had become too powerful to ignore. The Shining Path, led by Abimael Guzman, had begun targeting anyone who opposed them. They saw Maria not as a woman feeding the hungry, but as a threat, proof that grassroots organization could work without violence. In January, propaganda leaflets began appearing around Villa El Salvador. They called Maria a traitor, an ally of the bourgeois system. Her name was written in red ink, circled. She ignored them. "If I fall," she once told a journalist, "others will rise." The threats escalated. Shots were fired at her home. Strangers loitered outside the community center where she worked. Friends urged her to leave Lima for a while, but she refused. "If I go," she said, "what message does that send to the people who depend on us?" Then came February 15th, 1992. That morning, Villa El Salvador was preparing for a peace march, a local demonstration against terrorism, organized by Maria and several neighborhood groups. It was meant to be peaceful, symbolic, a show of unity. She spent the morning helping distribute food for the marchers, laughing with women she'd worked beside for years. Just before the event began, a group of armed men arrived on motorcycles. They were dressed in civilian clothes, but everyone knew who they were. Witnesses later said they moved with purpose, faces hidden behind scarves. They found Maria at a community meeting hall. Without a word, they dragged her outside. Some reports say she shouted for her children to stay back. Others remember her last words as calm, a quiet defiance. The men shot her twice in front of the crowd. Then, in a final act of terror, they detonated explosives beneath her body. The sound echoed through the dusty streets, scattering the marchers, silencing the square. When the smoke cleared, nothing was left but fragments. The bright banners of the peace marched torn and drifting in the hot wind. News spread fast. Within hours, radios across Peru were reporting her death. By nightfall, vigils had begun. Candles in jam jars lined the alleys of Villa El Salvador. Mothers wept openly in the streets. For the first time in months, Lima's city center fell quiet. The government condemned the attack. President Alberto Fujimori called it an act of cowardice and promised to bring the killers to justice. But in truth, everyone already knew who was responsible. The Shining Path issued a statement days later, coldly justifying the murder. They called her a reactionary figure, accusing her of betraying the revolution. Maria's funeral was held 3 days later at a local sports field because no church could hold the crowds. Tens of thousands came, women in shawls, students carrying hand-painted signs, foreign journalists. Her coffin, draped in the Peruvian flag, was carried through the streets by the same neighbors she had once fed. Her 2 young sons, Gustavo and David, walked behind it. The ceremony was interrupted briefly when a rumor spread that Shining Path members were nearby. People froze, but the threat never materialized. The crowd stayed until sunset, singing softly in unison, "No Mas Sangre, No Mas Miedo." After the funeral, Villa El Salvador became a fortress of community resolve. Soup kitchens reopened within days. Murals appeared on the walls, painted in bright reds and yellows, bearing her face and the words Madre, Courage Vive. Investigators pieced together what little they could about her killers. Intelligence sources identified several operatives within the Shining Path's Special Operations Wing, but none were captured. The case was effectively closed when, later that same year, Guzman himself was arrested by Peruvian police. Maria's murder became a turning point, not just politically, but emotionally. Many say it broke the Shining Path's hold over Lima's poorest neighborhoods. Her death became a rallying point. The same people who once whispered now began to speak again. The government later named several schools and public centers after her. There's a bronze statue of her now in Villa El Salvador, standing in a small plaza that overlooks the district's endless sprawl of tin roofs. It shows her holding a notebook in one hand and raising the other toward the sky. The base of the statue carries a single inscription which reads, "Neither fear nor death can stop life." The place where she died is still there, a small open courtyard lined with concrete benches and a few crooked trees. The air smells faintly of dust and old flowers. Locals say that when the sun sets just right, you can see the light reflecting off the stone plaque that bears her name, turning it gold for a few seconds before it fades again. No one speaks loudly there. They don't need to. Everyone already knows what happened on that February morning, when a voice that refused to be silent was finally silenced. Our next story takes place in Fort Worth, Texas, in October 1995. The small town of Springtown was quiet that autumn. The wind rattled the dry leaves along the streets, and a chill settled over the fields outside Fort Worth, where families lived close to farms and open stretches of land. It was in this ordinary setting that Tracy McBride, a 19-year-old Army private, disappeared. Tracy had been stationed at Fort Bliss, living a regimented life of drills, early mornings, and constant training. She was described by fellow soldiers as responsible and disciplined, someone who took her duties seriously but still maintained a warmth that made her easy to approach. On weekends, she liked to drive out of the base to visit family, or simply take in the Texas landscape. On the morning of October 31st, 1995, Tracy left the base early. She told friends she was going home to visit her family for the weekend. That was the last confirmed time anyone saw her alive. She never reached her family's home. The initial search was immediate. Her roommates at the barracks reported her missing when she didn't return. Military authorities, alongside local law enforcement, began combing the highways, wooded areas, and nearby towns. Her car was found abandoned near a rural road south of Fort Worth. The doors locked, her purse and personal belongings still inside. The investigation quickly revealed evidence of violent abduction. Tire marks in the dirt suggested a vehicle had pulled off the road and waited for her. Witnesses came forward to report seeing a dark-colored pickup truck near the area around the time she disappeared. None of the sightings provided a clear image of the vehicle's occupants, and the trail initially ran cold. Days later, a break came. Tracy's remains were discovered in a remote area of Johnson County, Texas, over 100 miles from Fort Worth. The location was deep in woodland, far from any main roads, where few people traveled. The authorities noted the method and brutality of her murder. She had been strangled and shot. The combination of these methods suggested personal rage or intent to eliminate any chance of survival or identification. A suspect soon emerged. Luis A. Vega, a former acquaintance with a minor criminal record who lived near the route Tracy was believed to have taken. He had previously been arrested for theft and had a history of violent outbursts, though nothing of this magnitude. Investigators pieced together the timeline from phone records, witness accounts, and vehicle tracking. Tracy had accepted a ride from someone she knew slightly, a decision that would prove fatal. The evidence included fibers from her clothing found in Vega's truck and small traces of DNA linking him directly to the crime scene. Vega was arrested a few weeks after Tracy's disappearance. During interrogation, he initially denied involvement, but forensic evidence and witness statements contradicted his account. Eventually, he confessed to abducting her and leading her to the wooded area where he killed her. His motive appeared to be a combination of sexual intent and rage when Tracy resisted. The trial moved quickly. Fort Worth courtroom was packed with family, military personnel, and media reporters. Prosecutors presented a straightforward narrative. A young woman leaving her base for routine family visits, intercepted by a man with violent intent, abducted, and murdered. The timeline of her disappearance, her abandoned car, and the forensic evidence formed an unbroken chain of events. Vega was convicted of capital murder and sentenced to death. The court records detail the chilling calmness with which he recounted the crime during the trial. His demeanor reflected the cold calculation seen in many predatory cases, a stark contrast to Tracy's ordinary weekend plans and the quiet expectations of her life. In the aftermath, the base community struggled to reconcile the safety of their environment with the violence inflicted upon one of their own. Officers implemented stricter protocols for soldiers traveling off-base, and psychological support was offered to those affected. Tracy's family established a small scholarship fund in her name, supporting young women pursuing military careers in Texas. The forest where her body was found remains largely unchanged. Thick undergrowth, narrow dirt paths, and occasional wildlife. Locals know the area, but rarely travel its deepest parts. The trees stand as silent witnesses, the rustle of leaves sometimes the only sound. For those who remember Tracy, the story is a quiet caution about ordinary routines shattered unexpectedly. A weekend drive, a simple stop on a rural road, a single wrong decision, and the world changes permanently. Our next story takes us to Aurora, Illinois, May 11th, 2011. That morning, 6-year-old Timothy Pitson was dropped off at his kindergarten class at Greenman Elementary by his father, James. It was an ordinary Wednesday. Clear skies, spring air, parents in and out of the school parking lot. Nothing seemed unusual, but just a few hours later, the school secretary called James to tell him that Timothy's mother, Amy Fry Pitson, had arrived unexpectedly and signed him out early. She told the staff there was a family emergency. It wasn't unusual for Amy to pick up Timothy. She was a devoted mother, energetic and affectionate, so no one questioned it. Security footage shows her walking him to her silver Ford Expedition, hand in hand. Timothy looks happy, excited even, skipping a little as they walk. That will be the last confirmed sighting of him. Amy Fry Pitson was 43, a mother of one, married for nearly a decade. Friends described her as outgoing but sometimes private, prone to mood swings and short periods of depression. The marriage, according to family members, had been strained for months. There had been arguments about finances, about trust, but to everyone outside their circle, they appeared stable, a loving family in a quiet suburban town. After signing her son out of school, Amy drove to a local car repair shop, dropped off her vehicle for some maintenance, and accepted a courtesy ride to the nearby Brookfield Zoo in Chicago. Surveillance footage confirmed their arrival there around 10 a.m. The two spent several hours at the zoo. The video shows them feeding animals, riding the tram. Timothy looks like any child on a day off with his mom. Later that afternoon, Amy picked up her car and drove west toward Illinois' farmlands. That night, the pair checked into the Key Lime Cove Resort, a family water park hotel in Gurnee. Staff remembered them. She seemed relaxed, and Timothy was laughing, running ahead of her down the hall. They spent the evening swimming and eating dinner at the resort buffet. The next morning, May 12th, Amy checked out, and the two continued their road trip. She made several short stops, including a gas station and a small zoo in Wisconsin Dells. Everywhere they went, cameras captured moments of calm normalcy. Timothy looking at animals, Amy holding his hand. But by Thursday night, something changed. Around 8 p.m., Amy called several family members, including her mother and brother-in-law. She said she and Timothy were fine, that they were on vacation and he was safe. "He belongs to me," she said calmly. Her tone was described later as oddly final. No one heard from her again after that call. The next day, May 13th, Amy was found dead in a motel room at the Rockford Inn in Rockford, Illinois, about 120 miles from Aurora. She had taken her own life. On the bed beside her were a few personal belongings, receipts from the trip, and a handwritten note. It read, "Timothy is safe. He is with people who love him and will care for him. You will never find him." There were no signs of struggle in the room, no evidence that Timothy had been there recently. The motel's security footage showed Amy checking in alone. Her car, parked outside, contained traces of blood, later confirmed to belong to Timothy. But investigators concluded it was from a nosebleed he'd suffered earlier in the trip. A nationwide search began immediately. Police combed through hours of surveillance footage, looking for any sign of the boy after Wisconsin Dells. There were none. Amy's phone records, credit card transactions, and gas station visits created a precise trail, right up until the last night, when the trail ended abruptly. The only clues were the note and a small amount of dirt and grass found on her SUV's undercarriage, a sample that experts traced to a rural area between Sterling and Mount Carroll, Illinois. Search teams spent weeks combing that region, through cornfields, wooded lots, and gravel roads. Nothing was ever found. As the days turned into months, the case took on an eerie rhythm of leads and dead ends. Witnesses came forward claiming to have seen a boy matching Timothy's description at rest stops or truck plazas. None were confirmed. Amy's family remained divided. Some believed she had handed him off to friends or a hidden contact, keeping him alive somewhere far from his father. Others feared the worst, that Timothy had never left that final stretch of highway. Years later, detectives revisited every frame of surveillance video, every receipt, every gas station timestamp. One haunting discovery stood out. At several points in the trip, Amy's phone had been briefly turned off, sometimes for hours at a time, only to power back on in completely different locations. Investigators believed those moments may have been when she made the handoff, if such an exchange ever happened. But there was never proof. In 2019, 8 years after the disappearance, news broke that stunned the nation. A teenager in Kentucky told police he was Timothy Pitson, claiming to have escaped from kidnappers who had held him captive for years. The story spread instantly. Headlines, interviews, the family's cautious hope. DNA tests were rushed through. The results came back within hours. The young man was not Timothy. He was a 23-year-old ex-convict named Brian Rennie, who later admitted to the hoax. The blow was devastating. "It's like losing him all over again," Timothy's grandmother said. After that, the case returned to silence. Today, more than a decade later, Timothy Pitson remains missing. No trace, no remains, no verifiable sighting. His case file with the Aurora Police Department is still open, reviewed periodically as new technologies emerge. Age progression images show what he might look like now. A young man of 20, with his mother's light brown hair and his father's smile. The last solid truth in his story remains those 3 days on the road. A mother and son seen laughing together, driving from one Illinois town to the next, with no one realizing it was the final time they'd be seen. Some believe Amy's final words were literal, that she found someone to care for him, someone who could give him a life far away from whatever she feared. Others believe the note was a desperate mother's attempt to protect her son's memory, even in death. Either way, somewhere between the highway towns and motel check-ins, the road just ends. A single mother's car parked outside a quiet inn, her child's seat empty in the back, and a line written in a trembling hand. "You will never find him." Our next story takes place in Houston, Texas, in February 1998. Carla Faye Tucker was 38 years old when her life, and eventual death sentence, captured the attention of the United States. She had grown up in Houston, a child of difficult circumstances, and had lived a life marked by poverty, instability, and brushes with the law. By her late teens, she had begun to use drugs, and her criminal record included theft, burglary, and several minor offenses. In 1983, Carla Faye's life took a darker turn. She and an accomplice, Daniel Garrett, broke into a home on a quiet suburban street in Houston. Inside, they encountered Jerry Dean and Deborah Thornton. A violent encounter ensued. Garrett struck both victims with a hammer, killing them instantly. Carla Faye, according to police reports, participated in the killings, using the same hammer in the attacks. Both victims were found inside their home. The scene chaotic and bloody, the brutality shocking even seasoned investigators. Her arrest came quickly after the crime. Witnesses identified both her and Garrett as the intruders. During interviews with police, Carla Faye admitted involvement, though the specifics of her participation were debated during her trial. She was charged with capital murder under Texas law, a crime that carried the possibility of the death penalty. The trial took place later that year. Prosecutors emphasized the premeditated nature of the crime, the extreme violence, and the fact that both victims were killed in their own home. Carla Faye's defense presented arguments of her troubled upbringing, her drug use at the time, and the influence of Garrett. Despite these mitigating factors, the jury found her guilty of capital murder. The sentence was death by lethal injection, a decision that sparked national debate. Carla Faye's case became one of the first instances in the United States where a woman was sentenced to death for a crime of this nature. Advocates for her clemency argued that women rarely commit such violent acts, that her personal transformation during incarceration demonstrated remorse, and that executing her would set a controversial precedent. While on death row, Carla Faye became a subject of media attention and religious advocacy. She converted to Christianity, corresponded with supporters, and participated in rehabilitation programs within the prison. Letters, interviews, and testimony from fellow inmates painted a picture of someone who had changed, someone attempting to reconcile the violence of her past with a new sense of purpose. Despite appeals and petitions for clemency, the legal process continued. Multiple courts reviewed her case, including arguments related to her mental health, her gender, and procedural matters during her trial. None succeeded in overturning the sentence. On February 3, 1998, Carla Faye Tucker was executed by lethal injection at the Huntsville unit, Texas. Witnesses noted her calm demeanor, the presence of spiritual advisors, and the finality of the procedure. Her execution marked a rare instance in modern U.S. history, the first woman executed in Texas since the early 20th century. The aftermath of Carla Faye's death resonated beyond Houston and the prison system. Discussions of capital punishment, gender, and rehabilitation intensified in both media and academic circles. Her story remained a reference point in debates over the death penalty, raising questions about justice, transformation, and the complexities of violent crime. The cell where she spent her final years is now empty, a reminder of the procedural and legal structures that govern the lives of those sentenced to death. Those who knew her story reflect on the ordinary streets of Houston where the crime began, the courtroom where decisions were made, and the stark finality of the Huntsville unit, where life ends under state authority. Our next story takes place in Olathe, Kansas, on the evening of June 2nd, 2007. Kelsey Smith was 18 years old, a recent high school graduate, full of energy and plans for college. She was described by friends as bubbly and caring, someone who could light up a room with her laughter. That Saturday evening, she left her apartment complex in Olathe to run errands and attend a friend's gathering. The streets were quiet, warm with the early summer air, the sun setting behind suburban homes. When Kelsey failed to return home later that night, her mother became concerned. She contacted the police, who immediately began a search in the surrounding neighborhoods. Officers canvassed the area, questioning neighbors, checking parking lots, and reviewing surveillance footage from local businesses. A witness recalled seeing a young woman matching Kelsey's description walking near a gas station on Santa Fe Drive around 9 p.m., approaching a man in a nearby truck. The interaction was brief, but enough to raise suspicion. The investigation quickly focused on Patrick Dennis Purdy, a man later identified through surveillance and witness reports. Purdy was known to local law enforcement due to prior offenses, though nothing indicated he was capable of such a violent act. Detectives pieced together evidence from traffic cameras, ATM withdrawals, and phone records, establishing a timeline that traced Kelsey's movements that evening and her last confirmed interactions. Authorities also discovered that Kelsey had been abducted near the apartment complex. Her car, a white sedan, was found parked a short distance away, keys in the ignition, doors locked, no sign of a struggle inside. The scene suggested that the abduction was sudden, an opportunity seized in a moment of vulnerability. Over the following days, law enforcement coordinated with multiple agencies, including the FBI, to track leads across Kansas and neighboring states. Canine units searched wooded areas, and volunteers assisted in door-to-door inquiries. Investigators focused on reconstructing the timeline of her disappearance, interviewing anyone who might have seen her, and analyzing digital footprints, such as cell phone pings, to determine her location in the hours following her disappearance. On June 7, 2007, the case took a tragic turn. Kelsey's remains were discovered in a rural area near K-10 Highway, approximately 15 miles from her apartment. The site was secluded, surrounded by dense trees and tall grass, the kind of location that offered little chance for a passerby to notice anything unusual. Forensic examination confirmed that she had been strangled, a violent act indicating both intent and premeditation. Patrick Dennis Purdy was arrested days later. Evidence collected during the investigation, including witness accounts, vehicle tracking, and forensics, linked him directly to the abduction and murder. During interrogation, he admitted to taking Kelsey from the apartment complex, leading investigators to the area where her body was eventually found. The trial proceeded in the Johnson County Courthouse. Prosecutors detailed the events of June 2nd, reconstructing the abduction, the timeline, and Purdy's movements. The jury examined the evidence, including testimony from neighbors, forensic experts, and law enforcement officials involved in the case. Purdy was convicted of first-degree murder and sentenced to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. The community responded with both grief and calls for enhanced safety measures. Parents in Olathe and surrounding areas began stricter supervision of their children, emphasizing awareness of surroundings and the importance of checking in. Local authorities increased patrols near residential complexes and worked with schools to educate students about personal safety. Despite the resolution in the legal system, the memory of Kelsey Smith lingers in Olathe. Her disappearance and murder are remembered during community gatherings, and her family established scholarships and safety awareness programs in her name. The quiet streets where she once walked are now viewed with a renewed sense of caution, a reminder of the fragility of ordinary moments. Our next story takes place in New York City, New York, on February 25th, 2006. Imette St. Guillen was 25 years old, a graduate student at John Jay College of Criminal Justice, studying to become a criminal investigator. She was described by friends and family as intelligent, ambitious, and deeply committed to her career. On that Saturday night, she attended a party in Manhattan, hoping to unwind after a week of classes. She left the party around 11 p.m., planning to return to her apartment in Brooklyn. Imette hailed a cab, as she often did, but she never made it home. Her disappearance was noticed the next morning when she failed to attend class and didn't answer calls or messages. Friends became concerned and alerted her family, who immediately contacted the NYPD. The investigation began with canvassing the area near the party and retracing the route she might have taken home. Security camera footage from nearby streets and buildings was reviewed. Witnesses reported seeing a young woman matching Imette's description entering a bar in Midtown Manhattan alone. She was later seen leaving with a man who would become the central suspect in the case. As the NYPD expanded its search, detectives gathered forensic evidence, reviewed phone records, and interviewed bar staff and patrons. They traced a series of movements leading to a small apartment in Brooklyn, where it became apparent that Imette had been abducted. Authorities identified Daryl C. Clark, a 34-year-old bouncer working at the Midtown bar, as the prime suspect. Clark had a prior criminal record, though not for violent crime, but his fingerprints and DNA were later linked to the crime scene and Imette's body. Investigators pieced together evidence from hotel security logs, vehicle rentals, and other surveillance footage to establish Clark's actions leading up to the abduction. 2 days after her disappearance, Imette's body was discovered in a dumpster behind a Brooklyn industrial area. The location was secluded, hidden from public view, and difficult to access without attracting attention. Forensic examination revealed that she had been sexually assaulted and strangled, confirming the worst fears of her family and friends. Clark was arrested shortly after the discovery. During interrogation, he initially denied involvement, but the mounting forensic evidence, including DNA, fibers, and surveillance footage, left little room for alternative explanations. Authorities reconstructed the timeline of the evening. After leaving the bar with Imette, Clark took her to the Brooklyn apartment where he committed the assault and murder, then disposed of her body in the dumpster. The trial was closely followed by national media. Prosecutors outlined the meticulous planning and violent actions, presenting DNA evidence, eyewitness accounts, and Clark's history. The jury reviewed hours of testimony from investigators, forensic experts, and Imette's family, establishing both premeditation and intent. Clark was convicted of murder, kidnapping, and sexual assault, and he received a life sentence without parole. The case drew attention not only because of the brutality of the crime, but also because of the visibility of New York City and the sense of vulnerability it brought to urban nightlife. Following Imette's murder, bars in Manhattan implemented stricter security measures, and public awareness campaigns reminded patrons to exercise caution when leaving establishments alone. Friends and classmates of Imette remember her dedication to criminal justice studies, her warmth, and the life she had ahead of her. Scholarships and programs were established in her honor, aiming to support young women pursuing careers in law enforcement and criminal investigation. The streets where she last walked remain ordinary, bustling with the city's constant rhythm, but the memory of that night lingers in the hearts of those who knew her. Our next story takes place in Middletown, Ohio, on November 14th, 1982. Krista Harrison was 10 years old, a bright and cheerful girl who lived with her family in a quiet neighborhood on the outskirts of Middletown. She enjoyed riding her bicycle, playing with friends, and exploring the local woods near her home. The town was small and tight-knit, where neighbors often knew each other by name, and children played outside with a sense of freedom that felt safe. On that Sunday morning, Krista left her home to run a simple errand. She was going to a nearby convenience store to pick up some items for her family. It was a route she had traveled many times before. Her mother expected her to return in less than an hour. When Krista did not come back, her family assumed she might have been delayed or stopped to talk with friends. Hours passed, and concern began to grow. By the afternoon, Krista's parents contacted the local police. Officers quickly organized a search of the surrounding streets, woods, and fields. They spoke with neighbors, store owners, and anyone who might have seen her that day. Witnesses recalled seeing a young girl matching Krista's description along a quiet residential street, walking alone. One resident reported noticing a man in a car watching the area, though the description was vague and no immediate leads were available. As days went on, the search intensified. Mounted police and volunteers scoured the woods, and investigators followed every tip, tracing potential routes Krista might have taken. The small-town community became deeply involved, distributing flyers and posting notices across Middletown and surrounding areas. Despite the efforts, there was no sign of her. No clothing, no bicycle, no personal items. Weeks later, Krista's remains were discovered in a secluded area near a creek several miles from her home. The location was heavily wooded, difficult to access, and far removed from any well-traveled paths. Forensic examination indicated that she had been strangled, and evidence suggested she had been abducted rather than lost or wandering. The discovery confirmed what the town had feared. Krista had been the victim of an unknown predator. Investigators quickly focused on local suspects and anyone with a history of criminal activity, attempting to reconstruct her last known movements. They analyzed reports from neighbors, vehicles seen near her home, and individuals who had recently moved into the area. The investigation faced challenges: limited eyewitness accounts, no direct leads, and a crime that appeared to be carefully concealed. Over the following months, law enforcement pursued several potential leads, interviewing residents and monitoring persons of interest. They collaborated with nearby jurisdictions, shared information, and attempted to match the crime with similar cases. However, the case remained unsolved for decades. Krista's disappearance and murder had a lasting effect on the community. Parents restricted children's outdoor activities, and the town's sense of security was forever altered. The woods and streets where she had once played became quiet and watched more closely, and the case became a symbol of vigilance in Middletown. Despite ongoing efforts and advances in forensic technology, Krista Harrison's case remains open. Investigators continue to receive tips and review cold leads, but her abductor has never been identified. The small neighborhood streets, the paths she rode her bike, and the secluded woods where her life ended carry the silence of unanswered questions, leaving only the memory of a bright young girl whose ordinary day ended in tragedy. Our next story takes place in Dardenne Prairie, Missouri, in October 2006. Megan Meyer was 13 years old, a student at a local middle school, known for her bright personality and artistic interests. She lived with her mother in a suburban neighborhood where children often rode bikes, walked to school, and spent evenings playing outside. Megan's life, like that of many teenagers, was shaped by friends, school, and the budding presence of social media, which she used to connect with classmates. In the weeks leading up to her death, Megan became involved in online interactions with someone she believed was a teenage boy named Josh Evans. The messages were frequent, seemingly friendly, and gradually took on a more personal tone. However, unbeknownst to Megan, the account was not real. It was created by Lori Drew, the mother of one of Megan's former friends, who intended to manipulate and intimidate her. The online exchanges escalated. Messages became increasingly cruel, with the fictional Josh sending statements suggesting that Megan was unloved and unwanted. The tone shifted from teasing to hostile, and Megan began expressing sadness and anxiety to friends and family. Her mother, noticing changes in Megan's mood, tried to offer support, but the depth of the manipulation was largely invisible to those around her. On October 16, 2006, Megan was found dead in her bedroom, having taken her own life. The discovery shocked the community. Neighbors, classmates, and school officials struggled to understand how a teenage girl could reach such a tragic decision. Police immediately launched an investigation into the circumstances surrounding her death, focusing on her online activity. Investigators retrieved Megan's computer and reviewed the messages sent from the Josh Evans account. The digital trail revealed that the account had been created by Lori Drew, using fabricated details to impersonate a peer. Law enforcement interviewed Lori Drew and others involved, uncovering the deliberate nature of the deception and the psychological pressure it had placed on Megan. The case became a legal precedent for discussions surrounding cyberbullying. Prosecutors explored charges under computer fraud and abuse statutes, arguing that Drew's actions had contributed directly to Megan's death. The legal proceedings were complex, as cyberbullying laws at the time were still developing. Public debate centered on accountability in online spaces, the vulnerability of minors, and the extent to which adults could be held responsible for digital harassment. While Drew was not convicted of charges directly related to Megan's death, the case prompted renewed awareness of the dangers of online interactions for adolescents. Schools and communities implemented educational programs on internet safety, social media etiquette, and recognizing signs of emotional distress in teenagers. Megan's story resonated beyond Dardenne Prairie. It became a reference in advocacy campaigns, news reports, and legislative discussions on protecting children from online harassment. Friends and family described her as compassionate, creative, and full of life, qualities overshadowed tragically by the cruelty she encountered in a virtual space. The quiet streets of Dardenne Prairie, the classrooms, and the bedrooms where children now log onto the internet carry the memory of Megan Meyer. The case is revisited in discussions of social responsibility, online ethics, and the real-world consequences of digital actions. Though Megan's life ended prematurely, her story continues to influence how communities and policymakers consider the intersection of technology, adolescence, and accountability. Our next story takes place in Pretoria, South Africa, in the early hours of February 14, 2013. Riva Steenkamp was 29 years old, a model, television personality, and aspiring law student. She had built a life in Johannesburg and Pretoria, known for her charisma, dedication to her career, and close relationships with friends and family. On Valentine's Day, she was at the home of her boyfriend, Oscar Pistorius, a prominent Paralympic athlete celebrated internationally for his achievements in track and field. Around 3:15 a.m., a series of gunshots shattered the quiet of the suburban home. Neighbors reported hearing 4 shots in quick succession. Emergency services were called immediately. Police arrived within minutes to find Riva Steenkamp lying fatally wounded behind a closed bathroom door. Pistorius, 26 at the time, had called the authorities himself, stating that he believed an intruder had entered the home and that he had fired in self-defense. The initial investigation focused on establishing the timeline and circumstances surrounding the shooting. Detectives secured the home, collected forensic evidence, and conducted interviews with neighbors and emergency responders. Ballistics reports confirmed that the shots fired had come from a 9mm pistol registered to Pistorius. Blood spatter analysis, the positions of Riva and Pistorius, and bullet trajectories were documented meticulously. Investigators also examined Riva's movements prior to the shooting. She had attended a dinner engagement that evening and returned home late. Her evening appeared normal, with no indications of conflict or concern. Friends and colleagues described her as excited for upcoming work projects and generally upbeat, making the abrupt violence of that night all the more shocking. As the investigation unfolded, authorities questioned Pistorius extensively. He maintained that he had believed an intruder was in the house and that he had fired through a locked bathroom door in fear for his life. Forensic teams noted the separation of the bedroom and bathroom, the bolt lock on the door, and the trajectory of the bullets, details crucial to evaluating the plausibility of the self-defense claim. Witness statements included neighbors who reported hearing arguments earlier in the evening, though none confirmed any physical altercation. Security personnel from surrounding residences described hearing the shots and observing Pistorius' frantic exit from the house, calling emergency services. The case went to trial in 2014. Prosecutors argued that the shooting was intentional, citing prior incidents of aggressive behavior, forensic evidence, and inconsistencies in Pistorius' account. The defense maintained the intruder scenario, emphasizing Pistorius' fear, the bolt on the bathroom door, and his status as a disabled athlete relying on prosthetics that limited his mobility. The courtroom proceedings were broadcast widely, drawing international attention. Experts in forensic science, psychology, and firearm use testified, detailing how the shooting unfolded. Photographs, diagrams of the residence, and ballistic reconstructions were presented to the jury. Over several months, the trial examined Pistorius' actions, the credibility of witness statements, and the physical evidence recovered at the scene. In September 2014, Pistorius was convicted of culpable homicide, a finding that he had caused Riva's death negligently, but without intent to kill. He was sentenced to 5 years in prison, though appeals and subsequent judicial reviews later altered the sentence, ultimately resulting in a conviction for murder with a longer custodial term. Riva Steenkamp's death prompted discussions about intimate partner violence, firearm safety, and the responsibilities of public figures in South Africa. Memorials, tributes, and public statements highlighted her life and career, while the case continued to influence debates on criminal justice and media coverage of high-profile trials. The suburban home in Pretoria, once the setting of a quiet life, became a point of intense scrutiny and tragic memory. Streets that had been ordinary were forever associated with that February morning. The echo of gunfire, and a young woman's life abruptly ended. The trial documents, forensic reports, and media coverage preserve the events, yet the emotional resonance of Riva Steenkamp's death continues to reverberate across communities and nations. Our next story takes place in Soham, Cambridgeshire, in August 2002. Holly Wells, 10, and her friend Jessica Chapman, also 10, were last seen on the afternoon of August 4th. They had attended a local fun fair in the small town of Soham, a place where children could usually walk freely to school, friends' houses, and neighborhood events. That day, the sun was warm, the streets filled with families enjoying summer activities. Holly and Jessica left the fair with plans to return home for dinner, but they never arrived. Their families, noticing the delay and the unusual silence, began searching the streets and local parks. By early evening, the police were contacted and the Cambridgeshire Constabulary initiated a search operation. Officers canvassed neighborhoods, spoke to residents, and coordinated with local volunteers. Flyers with photographs of the girls were distributed across the town, and roadblocks were set up on surrounding routes. Investigators interviewed everyone who had interacted with the girls that day. They traced their movements to the fun fair, noting the last confirmed sighting: the 2 girls walking toward a nearby street lined with residential homes. Some witnesses recalled seeing a man in a van who appeared to be watching the children, but the descriptions were initially vague. The police treated this as a possible abduction and worked to identify potential suspects in the area. Forensic teams examined the girls' belongings in nearby areas for any trace evidence. The case quickly escalated in urgency due to the girls' ages and the potential danger posed by an unknown abductor. Local media covered the disappearance extensively, increasing public awareness and prompting hundreds of tips and sightings from residents and neighboring towns. As the investigation continued, authorities identified Ian Huntley, a 36-year-old school caretaker with access to the girls' school. Huntley had a prior history of allegations involving inappropriate behavior with minors, though he had not been convicted. Police interviews and background checks focused on his connections to the school and his movements on the day of the disappearance. Search operations expanded to properties owned or frequented by Huntley. In early September, the police discovered the girls' bodies buried in a disused area behind Huntley's home. Forensic analysis confirmed that Holly and Jessica had been strangled. The location was secluded, difficult to access, and showed evidence that the murders had been planned in advance. Huntley was arrested and interrogated extensively. He initially provided inconsistent statements, claiming limited knowledge of the girls' whereabouts. Investigators, however, had gathered forensic evidence, witness accounts, and digital records that contradicted his story. Fiber analysis, soil examination, and other physical evidence directly linked Huntley to the scene. The trial that followed drew national attention. Prosecutors outlined a timeline, forensic findings, and Huntley's background. Expert witnesses described the methods used to conceal the bodies, the significance of the forensic links, and the behavioral profile of the perpetrator. In December 2003, Huntley was convicted of the murder of Holly Wells and Jessica Chapman and sentenced to life imprisonment with a minimum of 40 years. The Soha murders sent shockwaves through the United Kingdom. The community, once considered safe and quiet, experienced heightened vigilance. Schools implemented stricter security measures, and public awareness campaigns highlighted the importance of monitoring children's interactions and reporting suspicious behavior. Families adjusted routines, children were accompanied more frequently, and the tragedy left a lasting imprint on the town. The streets where Holly and Jessica walked, the park where they played, and the neighborhood that once felt safe remain quiet reminders of the events of that August. The investigation, trial, and community response continue to serve as documented records, preserving the details of the case and the memory of the two young girls whose lives ended far too soon. Our next story takes place in Homosassa, Florida, in February 2005. Jessica Lunsford was 9 years old, a bright and outgoing girl who lived with her family in the quiet community of Homosassa. She was known for her lively personality, love of school, and enjoyment of spending time outdoors. Jessica often walked to nearby friends' homes and enjoyed playing in her neighborhood. On the morning of February 24th, Jessica was reported missing by her family. She had left home earlier that day and did not return. The local police were notified immediately, and a search was launched. Officers canvassed streets, checked local stores and playgrounds, and spoke with neighbors. Flyers with her photograph were distributed throughout the community, and media outlets broadcast alerts across Florida. Investigators quickly focused on local residents, attempting to identify anyone who might have had contact with Jessica or exhibited suspicious behavior. The case intensified after it was discovered that John Cooey, a 46-year-old man with a history of sexual offenses against minors, lived in the area. Cooey had previously been convicted for kidnapping and assault, making him a primary suspect. Search teams expanded to include Cooey's property. Law enforcement obtained search warrants and began examining his home and surrounding areas. Evidence collected included soil samples, personal items, and items indicating that someone had been concealed on the property. Canine units and forensic specialists were deployed to locate Jessica, combing through dense vegetation and structures around Cooey's residence. After a thorough investigation, authorities discovered Jessica's body buried in the backyard of Cooey's home. Forensic analysis revealed she had been sexually assaulted and murdered, and evidence tied Cooey directly to her abduction. Investigators reconstructed the timeline. Cooey had lured Jessica to his home, held her captive for several days, and ultimately killed her. The arrest of John Cooey followed swiftly. He was interrogated and eventually confessed to the crime, detailing the methods he used to abduct and conceal Jessica. The confession, combined with the physical evidence, led to formal charges of first-degree murder, sexual assault, and kidnapping. The trial began in 2007, drawing national attention. Prosecutors presented a detailed timeline, forensic findings, and testimony regarding Cooey's criminal history. Experts explained the methods used to identify, locate, and link Jessica to the suspect. The court heard from family members and community witnesses, emphasizing the impact of the crime on the Homosassa community. Cooey was convicted on all counts and sentenced to death. The case led to significant public attention on laws protecting children, particularly regarding the monitoring and rehabilitation of convicted sex offenders. It also prompted initiatives in schools and communities to educate children and families on recognizing danger and seeking help. Jessica Lunsford's death left an indelible mark on her community. The streets she walked, the neighborhood she played in, and the local schools became areas of heightened awareness and caution. Flyers, memorials, and tributes were established to remember her life and to advocate for child safety across Florida and the United States. The quiet community of Homosassa, once considered safe, was forever changed by the events of February 2005. Law enforcement records, forensic reports, and media documentation preserve the details of the case, ensuring that Jessica's story, though tragic, remains a record of both loss and the response it inspired. Our next story takes place in Atlanta, Georgia, in April 1913. Mary Fagan was just 13 years old, a factory worker employed at the National Pencil Company, where she spent her days assembling pencils under the supervision of adult staff. She was described by neighbors and co-workers as polite, diligent, and eager to help her family. On the morning of April 26, 1913, Mary arrived at the factory, prepared for a day of work. That afternoon, she did not return home. Her absence was noticed when her mother asked about her whereabouts. Rumors quickly spread through the neighborhood. By the following morning, her body was discovered in the factory's basement, lying face down in a pool of blood. Investigators quickly arrived, cordoning off the area and beginning a forensic examination, which at the time consisted primarily of documenting the scene, collecting trace evidence, and interviewing witnesses. Mary's murder sparked immediate outrage and attention in Atlanta. Police questioned factory employees, neighbors, and anyone who had seen her that day. Attention soon focused on Leo Frank, the factory superintendent, who had been seen speaking with Mary earlier in the day. Frank was brought in for questioning and underwent a series of interviews over several days. Investigators relied on witness testimonies, which included claims that Frank had displayed inappropriate behavior toward Mary. Forensic evidence was limited, as investigative techniques in 1913 were rudimentary. However, statements about Mary's movements, Frank's actions, and the timeline of the murder became central to the case. Police also examined written documents and payroll logs to reconstruct the factory's operations on the day of the crime. Leo Frank was arrested and charged with murder. The trial began amid intense public scrutiny, drawing national attention due to the sensational nature of the crime and the social tensions in the region. Prosecutors presented the case using witness statements, the circumstances of Mary's death, and Frank's alleged behavior. The defense argued inconsistencies in witness accounts and the lack of direct physical evidence. The jury deliberated and found Leo Frank guilty, and he was sentenced to death by hanging. The case, however, continued to stir controversy. In 1915, following legal appeals and petitions for clemency, Frank's sentence was commuted to life imprisonment by the governor of Georgia, citing concerns about trial fairness and procedural issues. Frank's commutation ignited public outrage. A group of men abducted him from prison in 1915 and lynched him, taking justice into their own hands. Mary Fagan's murder, the subsequent trial, and Frank's lynching left an indelible mark on Atlanta's history, highlighting deep divisions along social, ethnic, and religious lines in early 20th century America. Mary's death led to increased awareness of child labor conditions, factory oversight, and the necessity for clearer investigative standards. Her story is preserved through court documents, newspaper archives, and historical accounts, documenting not only the crime itself, but also the societal consequences that unfolded in its aftermath. Austin, Texas, 1884. The city was small then, barely more than a few thousand people, lit by gas lamps that hissed softly through the night. Horses pulled carriages down dusty streets, and at the edges of the city, wooden homes leaned against the quiet, their windows thinly curtained, their doors kept loosely latched. By day, Austin was bustling with construction, new hotels, a railway line, the promise of a growing state capital. But by night, something else stirred. Between 1884 and 1885, 7 women were attacked in their sleep. Most of them were black servant girls. All of them were taken in silence. The first killing came just after Christmas, in December of 1884. Her name was Molly Smith. She worked as a servant for a family on Pecan Street, now called 6th. Her employer, a man named Walter Hall, had gone to bed around midnight. When he woke near dawn, The back door stood ajar. Molly's bed was empty. Her body was found behind the home, laid out in the snow-dusted yard, partially undressed, a single deep wound above her ear. The police arrived quickly, though there was little they could do. There were no fingerprints, no footprints, just the dull metallic scent that lingered even after the ground was cleaned. A heavy axe was found nearby. No one claimed it. At the time, Austin had no formal homicide division. The constables, mostly Civil War veterans and drifters, relied on instinct. They suspected lovers, jealous husbands, prowlers. But nothing fit. Molly's boyfriend was jailed briefly, questioned until morning, then released when his alibi held. The murder was declared unresolved. In May of the following year, another woman was killed, Eliza Shelley. She worked for a prominent Austin family, and like Molly, she was found outside her employer's home. Her skull had been crushed. The weapon was the same, a common axe, cleaned roughly and left in the yard. People began locking their doors earlier. Dogs were chained closer to porches. The city's small newspaper, the Austin Statesman, began referring to the killer as a midnight assassin. The name stuck. Over the next several months, the pattern grew clearer. Each victim was attacked in her home, usually while she slept. The killer entered through a window or an unlatched door, struck fast, and disappeared before sunrise. There was no theft, no ransom, no sign of personal motive. In September 1885, 2 more women were killed. Rebecca Ramey's daughter, a young girl, and a cook named Mary Ramey, who was found in the yard with her head split open. By now, the city was gripped with terror. Patrols roamed the streets at night. Men gathered in small groups with rifles, standing guard outside boarding houses. Then came Christmas Eve, 1885. That night, 2 more women died, Eula Phillips and Susan Hancock. Both white, both attacked within an hour of each other in separate neighborhoods. For the first time, the city's wealthy were touched by the violence. The killings were more brutal than before. Eula's husband, James Phillips, was found wandering the street afterward, his clothes stained with blood, muttering that someone had broken in. The police arrested him before sunrise. By morning, every paper in Texas carried the story. The Statesman called it the most fearful and mysterious crime ever committed in the state. The term servant girl annihilator appeared for the first time. The governor offered a $3,000 reward. Pinkerton detectives were summoned from Chicago. They found little. Witnesses claimed to see a tall man, sometimes barefoot, moving through alleys at night. Others said they heard whistling outside windows, followed by silence. Inside the jail, James Phillips sat in a cell for months, awaiting trial for his wife's murder. The evidence against him was thin, but the city needed someone to blame. Meanwhile, the killing stopped. By the spring of 1886, Austin began to return to its routine. The new Capitol building rose from the red clay. The newspapers grew quieter. The midnight assassin was fading into rumor. Then the strange reports began. A woman claimed to see a shadow moving along the rooftops near Congress Avenue. Another said a man had been watching her through her kitchen window for several nights, vanishing when she screamed. None of the stories could be confirmed. The Pinkerton agents returned north. The constables went back to chasing thieves and drunks. The cases were left in boxes in the courthouse basement. Decades later, a retired officer would recall the investigation. He said there were details the public was never told. That one of the axes had been sharpened with a file, not a grindstone. That footprints found near the Phillips house were bare, the toes pointing slightly outward. That a small piece of candle wax was found near one victim's bed, though no one in the house had used a candle that night. Rumors lingered. Some said the killer left for New Orleans. Others believed he joined the circus that passed through the city in early 1886. A few years later, the Whitechapel murders began in London. Newspapers on both sides of the Atlantic wondered if the servant girl annihilator and Jack the Ripper could have been the same man. There were similarities, the mutilations, the choice of women living on the margins, the silence of the attacks. But there was never proof. In Austin, the case faded into the dry Texas air. Streets were renamed, the wooden homes replaced by brick. The last surviving witness, a woman who had been a child during the killings, once told a reporter that her mother used to wake at the faintest sound of footsteps on the porch, years after the murder stopped. In the city's archives, the reports still exist. Handwritten pages describing women taken from their beds, one by one, their lives cut short before dawn. The words are clinical, stripped of feeling, wounds to the head, body removed from the house, property not disturbed. Nothing connects them but the pattern and the quiet certainty that whoever it was, he walked away unseen. When historians revisited the case in the 20th century, they found only fragments. The names of the victims, the incomplete police notes, the few photographs that survived. The rest have been lost in fires and floods. Even now, the story feels half-buried. The old neighborhoods where the killings took place are gone, replaced by offices and parking lots. But some of the old limestone foundations remain beneath the newer buildings. Workers digging foundations in the 1970s found iron nails, bits of cloth, and once, the rusted head of an axe. No one could say if it meant anything. At the state archives, one page from the Phillips case is marked in pencil. No further action. Suspect released. The handwriting is faint, almost rubbed away. Beneath it, another note reads, subject moved north, possibly St. Louis. There were no follow-up reports. The identity of the man who crept through the gaslit streets of Austin, entering homes in silence, was never found. The killings stopped as suddenly as they began. But sometimes, in the summer heat, when the air presses still against the windows, the city feels older than it should. Streets curve where they shouldn't. Lamplight pulls the same way it did back then. And every so often, someone walking alone at night swears they hear it. The faint scrape of something metal against wood, somewhere just out of sight. It began in Moscow's northwestern districts, an area of faded apartment blocks, cold light, and long, empty courtyards that caught the sound of footsteps in winter. Between 2002 and 2006, residents started finding bodies near the rail lines that cut through those neighborhoods. At first, no one noticed the pattern. The city was large, its police overworked, its winters long. Deaths came and went quietly. But the faces, when there were faces left to recognize, had something in common. They were covered. The first was found behind a kiosk near Reknoy Vauxhall. A man in his 50s, local, an electrician. He'd been stabbed repeatedly, but his face had been wrapped in a cheap latex mask, a smiling one, the kind sold at outdoor markets during the New Year festivals. The police treated it as an isolated act of cruelty. They filed it away. A month later, a woman was found 2 districts away, in a small park half buried under snow. She had been beaten, then strangled. The same type of mask covered her face, but this one was different. Painted like a clown, its mouth frozen in an exaggerated grin. A cigarette, but lay beside her, perfectly balanced on the ice. By spring of 2003, there were 4 victims. Each death occurred within walking distance of a metro station. Each was killed at night. The bodies found the next morning by commuters or sanitation workers. No witnesses, no footprints, except those washed away by snow or rain. The tabloids called the Maska the mask. At first, the killings drew little national attention. Moscow's crime rate was still high in those years, and the early 2000s were a time of transition. New money, new buildings, but also a strange sense of anonymity. The police followed leads that went nowhere. One detective described the feeling as chasing a shadow through fog. The investigation changed direction after the 5th victim. He was a young man, 23, found near a playground on a quiet residential street. This time, there was something different. The mask wasn't plastic. It was leather, homemade. The stitching ran unevenly across the seams, as if hand-done. Inside, forensic technicians found a faint residue of glue mixed with hair fibers that didn't belong to the victim. A task force was formed under Major Antonov, a veteran investigator known for his patience. He ordered every mask vendor in Moscow questioned. Thousands of records were checked. Imports from China, factory runs, local artisans. Nothing matched. Whoever made them had done it privately. Then, in late 2004, an elderly woman came forward. She ran a small repair shop on the outskirts of the city, near Tichino. She told police that a man had visited her several times between 2002 and 2003, asking her to mend torn gloves and occasionally strange costume pieces. When asked to describe him, she hesitated. She remembered his hands more than his face. They were covered in scars, she said. She showed them the drawer where she kept old orders. Among them was a slip of paper, faded but with the name M. Kalinev. The police ran it through their database and found a partial match. Mikhail Konstantinovich Lunev, age 41, former costume designer for a small theater troupe that had closed in 1999. No criminal record. Lived alone in a Khrushchevka block near the Sokol metro. When officers arrived at his apartment, no one answered. The neighbors said he was quiet, polite, always carrying fabric rolls. He hadn't been seen for several days. They forced entry. The apartment was clean. Too clean. The kind of sterile order that made the detectives uneasy. In the main room, the wallpaper was stripped to the plaster. On the walls hung masks, dozens of them, arranged in careful rows. Human faces cast in plaster, others made from latex, some painted, some plain. Each bore a number written in pencil beneath it. There were 19 in total. They found no human remains, no blood, but in the corner stood an old trunk. Inside were sketches, pencil drawings of faces labeled only with dates. The earliest was 2002. The most recent, 3 weeks before the raid. The media learned of it within hours. The story ran on national television. Moscow masked man suspect found. But Lunev was nowhere to be found. His passport was missing, and his bank account had been closed months earlier. A single Metro card was left on the kitchen counter, still loaded with credit. Over the next 2 years, the murders stopped. Police believed he'd either fled or taken his own life. The masks were locked away in evidence storage, tagged, and forgotten. Until 2008. That year, a construction crew demolishing a warehouse near Koroshevo discovered a hidden room behind a bricked-over doorway. Inside, they found clothing, bones, and fragments of rubber masks half melted from heat. It looked like someone had tried to burn everything. Among the debris was a metal ID badge, corroded but legible. It read MKL. DNA testing identified the remains as belonging to 2 individuals. One was an unknown male. The other matched the profile of one of the early victims from 2003. The investigators could never explain how that was possible. After the warehouse find, rumors spread. Some claimed that Lunev hadn't worked alone, that the killings were part of something broader. A performance art circle, a clandestine theater group obsessed with identity and death. But the files give no indication of that. What they do mention, briefly, is a single note found at the scene. It was written in neat Cyrillic script on the back of a costume invoice. When they were the face, they stopped being afraid. The handwriting didn't match any known sample from Lunev. The Moscow police closed the case in 2009, citing insufficient evidence. But unofficially, detectives kept a watch on similar incidents. Every few years, a new case appeared. A woman in St. Petersburg, a homeless man in Yaroslavl, each found with a mask over the face. Always different materials, but the same precision. No suspect has ever been confirmed. The photos from the apartment still exist in the archives, filed under Objects 1 to 19. They were never displayed publicly. One officer, years later, described them from memory. They looked almost alive. You'd swear the eyes were following you. In 2017, an anonymous parcel was delivered to a Moscow radio station. Inside was a single latex mask, pale and expressionless, folded carefully in wax paper. No note. The return address was a vacant building that had once housed the old theater troupe where Lunev worked. Police collected it. The file was reopened for 6 months. Nothing came of it. To this day, there's no record of Lunev's body ever being found. No verified sightings, no confession. His apartment block has since been renovated, the walls repainted, the neighbors replaced. But some of the older residents still say that, late at night, they sometimes hear faint footsteps in the hallway, slow, measured, pausing outside certain doors. When they check, there's no one there. Only the sound of someone exhaling softly through something thin and flexible like rubber. Wakefield, West Yorkshire, 1983. The winter of 1983 settled heavily over West Yorkshire. Pinderfield's Hospital on Aberford Road stood against the dark sky like a monolith, all brick and glass, its wards glowing faintly through the fog. The place never truly slept. Ambulances hummed in and out through the night, the faint whine of their engines carrying across the car park. Inside, the corridors smelled of antiseptic and wet wool coats. Visitors came and went, their footsteps echoing on linoleum floors. On the evening of January 12th, a nurse named and Kelsey began her night shift in the surgical ward. She was 28, quiet, competent, and known for her steady hands. The ward housed mostly post-op patients, older men recovering from chest surgeries, a few women in traction. Around midnight, she made her rounds, checking 4 lines and recording temperatures. The hospital was understaffed that night. Only 2 nurses were assigned to the floor. Down the corridor, a security guard named Ian Broughton made his patrols, a man in his 40s, ex-army, methodical and polite. The first sign that something was wrong came at 2:17 a.m. when a patient buzzed for assistance. He said he'd heard a sound in the corridor, like someone dragging metal along the floor. And when a look, the hallway lights flickered slightly, an old wiring issue the maintenance staff had never fixed. As she reached the nurse's station, she saw a shape moving at the far end of the hall. A man, tall, wearing a dark overcoat. His face was partly hidden under a hood. She called out, thinking he was a visitor who'd wandered in from another ward. The man stopped. Then he began to walk toward her, slow and deliberate. What happened next was later reconstructed from witness statements, because Anne herself couldn't clearly remember. The man reached her before she could move. In his hand was an axe, small, the kind used for splitting wood. The first blow caught her across the arm as she raised it. The second struck her shoulder. She fell backward, hitting the floor hard. Down the hall, a patient began shouting for help. The man turned, stepped over her, and walked quickly toward the double doors. By the time Broughton arrived from the other end of the corridor, the attacker was gone. The hospital went into lockdown. Police were called. Officers searched every exit, but whoever he was, he'd already slipped out into the fog and survived. The axe had fractured her collarbone, but missed the artery. She was conscious when paramedics arrived, able to describe the man only as tall, silent, wearing a hood. She said his eyes looked calm, not angry. The investigation began within hours. Detective from Wakefield CID examined the ward, finding faint footprints leading toward the fire stairs, damp prints, as if the man had come in from the rain. The fire door had been forced open from the outside. There were no security cameras in that section of the hospital then. By morning, the story was everywhere. Axe attack at Pinderfield's ran across the front page of the Yorkshire Post. Reporters gathered outside the main entrance, their breath fogging in the cold. The hospital's administrator issued a statement, calling it an isolated incident. Staff were offered counseling, but within a week, another event occurred. At a smaller private facility 5 miles away, St. Christopher's, a night porter reported seeing a man matching the same description in a rear corridor shortly after 3 a.m. The man had been carrying something under his coat. When confronted, he said nothing, only turned and left through the side door. The porter described him as a little too calm. Police linked the 2 incidents, though no one had been hurt at St. Christopher's. They began checking mental health records, local parolees, and discharged psychiatric patients. Nothing matched. Then came the second attack. On February 3rd, a nurse named Julie Morton was walking to her car after a late shift at Pontefract General, about 15 miles from Wakefield. The car park was poorly lit, lined with frost. She'd just reached her car door when she heard footsteps behind her, slow, measured. She turned, expecting another staff member. The man was holding an axe. He swung once, striking the bonnet of her car instead of her head as she ducked. The sound echoed across the empty lot. She ran, slipping on the ice, shouting for help. By the time 2 porters came running from the main doors, the attacker had disappeared again into the dark. His footprints, tracked briefly in the snow, led toward the main road and vanished at the curb. The press began calling him the hospital axeman. Dozens of tips came in, sightings, rumors, false confessions. Police questioned night workers from every nearby facility: orderlies, ambulance drivers, boiler technicians. They even checked lumber yards for recent axe purchases. Nothing. The attacks stopped as suddenly as they began. By the end of spring, the case went cold, and Kelsey eventually returned to work, though she requested transfer to a day ward. In interviews years later, she said she never saw the man's face clearly. Only the way he moved, steady, almost practiced, like someone walking through a place they already knew. 10 years later, in 1993, new forensic reviews reopened several unsolved cases from the 80s, including Pinderfield's. Detectives examined the old evidence boxes, photographs, typed reports, the plaster casts of footprints from the corridor. Moisture had warped most of the files, but one item stood out: a section of door frame from the fire stair, marked with a partial fingerprint. The print was too incomplete for comparison then. It was entered into the system again in 1994. No match. In 2007, during a database update, a technician noticed something: a partial alignment between that print and one from a burglary in Leeds, 1985. The suspect from that case, a man named Peter Latham, had disappeared before trial. He'd worked briefly as a maintenance assistant at Pinderfield's in late 1982. He was never found. Police issued no public statement. The case file was reclassified as inactive, but retained for reference. Today, Pinderfield Hospital is larger, rebuilt with new wings and security systems. The old corridors are gone. The surgical ward where it happened no longer exists, demolished during the 1998 expansion. But staff who worked there in the old building still remember the story. They say that sometimes, on late shifts, motion sensors near the service stairs would trigger with no one around. A door would open slowly and close again. No one ever saw anyone enter. Perth, Western Australia, 1963 to 1964. The suburb of Mount Hawthorn was quiet in the early 1960s. A mix of tidy post-war homes, brick fences, and lawns that smelled of eucalyptus after dusk. Families kept their doors unlocked. Neighbors called across driveways. The nights were long, still, and predictable. That changed in November 1963. Just after midnight, residents on Shakespeare Street woke to the sound of breaking glass. A woman screamed, one sharp cry, then silence. When police arrived, they found the back door of the Carmichael home forced open. Inside, 32-year-old Margaret Carmichael lay in the kitchen. Her body collapsed near the pantry. An axe rested beside her, its wooden handle streaked with blood. Her husband, Alan, had been asleep in the bedroom. He told police he'd woken to a muffled thud, then the crash of dishes. When he rushed to the kitchen, he saw a man in a dark coat stepping out the back door. The figure wore a mask, smooth and pale, like a face carved from wax. Alan chased him into the yard, but the man disappeared over the fence into the darkness. The police initially suspected a burglary gone wrong. Nothing had been stolen, but the house showed signs of a search. Drawers pulled open, cupboards ransacked. They found muddy footprints leading from the back steps into the alley. Then nothing. Margaret's death was ruled a homicide by blunt force trauma. The papers called it the Shakespeare Street murder. Perth wasn't used to killings like that. Then, 3 weeks later, another break-in. This time on Anzac Road, less than 2 kilometers away. The homeowner, an elderly widow named Mrs. Dyer, woke to a light flickering in the hallway. She said she saw someone standing near her door, tall, thin, wearing a white mask. When she screamed, the figure ran, knocking over a lamp. No one was hurt, but the police found the same type of footprints in the garden soil. The city grew tense. Residents installed locks and bought dogs. Children were kept inside after dark. By February 1964, 5 more incidents had been reported, all within a 10-kilometer radius, all involving a masked intruder. In 3 of those cases, an axe had been taken from the victim's own shed or tool room. The attacks followed a pattern. The homes were chosen seemingly at random, late at night, with no attempt to steal. The press gave the intruder a name: the masked axe killer of Perth. Detectives from the Criminal Investigation Branch formed a task force. They canvassed hardware stores, hospitals, costume shops. They questioned men who'd recently been released from Fremantle Prison. No suspect matched the description. The police sketches showed a white mask with hollow eye sockets and a slit for the mouth, something between a mannequin face and a butcher's mask. In April, the attack stopped. For nearly 6 months, there was nothing. Then came October 3rd. At 11:45 p.m., a young couple, John and Carol Reeves, returned to their home in Subiaco after a dinner party. Carol went to the kitchen to make tea. John stepped in the yard to smoke. He heard the sound of metal scraping against wood, faint, rhythmic. He turned toward the shed, thinking it was the wind. The door was open, swaying slightly. When he moved closer, he saw an axe leaning against the wall. Then a shadow shifted behind the doorway. John shouted. The figure stepped out, tall, masked, wearing a dark coat. The man didn't run. He raised the axe once, slowly, as if testing the weight. John backed away, tripped over the garden hose, and scrambled toward the house. Carol screamed from inside. By the time neighbors came running, the intruder was gone. Carol survived, but the encounter left deep cuts across her arm and shoulder. The axe again belonged to the victims. Police increased night patrols. Checkpoints were set up along the main roads, leaving the suburbs. More than 200 men were questioned. One of the detectives, Inspector Harold Baines, told the press, "We believe the individual is local. He knows these streets well." That detail, local, unsettled people more than anything. In November, a break came from an unlikely source. A mechanic named Peter Lawton reported a strange customer at his garage on Scarborough Beach Road. The man had brought in a panel van, asking for the back windows to be covered with metal sheets for privacy. Lawton remembered the man's hands, rough, scarred, and the faint smell of kerosene on his clothes. Police traced the registration to a George Mallory, age 44, a part-time laborer who rented a small house near the coast. When officers arrived, Mallory wasn't home. They entered with a warrant. Inside the shed, they found a workbench covered in tools, a half-empty can of paint thinner, and hanging from a nail, a white plaster mask. The mask was crudely molded, but the shape matched witness descriptions almost perfectly. In a locked box under the bench were newspaper clippings of the attacks, carefully cut out and dated. 2 days later, Mallory's body was found in the dunes outside City Beach. He had taken his own life with a length of electrical cord. Forensics confirmed that his boots matched the prints found at 2 of the crime scenes. His fingerprints were on the axe from the Subiaco attack. The case was closed, but not everyone agreed. Neighbors described Mallory as quiet, polite, almost timid. He'd suffered head injuries in a car accident years earlier, and sometimes seemed confused. His employer said he'd missed several nights of work during the attacks, but others recalled seeing him at the same time across town. One of the surviving victims, Carol Reeves, told reporters she wasn't sure it was the same man. The eyes didn't look right, she said. They were smaller. The mask fit too tightly. In later years, small details didn't line up. Mallory's suicide note was vague, almost detached. He wrote, "It's better this way. I couldn't stop it." Investigators wondered if he'd meant his actions or someone else's. Then, in 1968, 4 years after the final attack, a homeowner in Mount Hawthorne reported hearing someone moving outside his kitchen window late at night. When police arrived, they found an axe leaning against the fence and a set of footprints in the damp soil. The prints matched none in the national database. The file was reopened briefly, then closed again. Perth moved on. Today, the case remains an odd fragment of the city's history, rarely spoken of, half remembered. The houses on Shakespeare Street look different now, renovated and bright. Children play in the same yards where the headlines once warned of a masked man. But every few years, someone reports seeing a figure near the old railway line, tall, wearing a pale face. Always at night, always walking alone. They say he carries something over his shoulder, swinging it lightly as he moves, the rhythm slow and even like someone keeping time.